The Mafia boss's early return left the maid urging, "Stay silent. The truth will stun you." Rain fell like a judgment across the Viti estate, each drop tracing the cold marble steps and turning the drive into a mirror for the street. Lorenzo Viti's Civic cut through the sheen with a surgeon's precision, his face in the rear view. A mask he kept for himself, not for his enemies. He had meant to arrive tomorrow. Plans change. Power, he believed, required unpredictability. Surprises kept teeth sharp. The house was wrong the moment he stepped through the iron gates. It wasn't just dark. It was staged darkness, the kind that pretends to be absence and instead screams of intent. The foyer, a cavern of family portraits and heavy air, smelled faintly of Veronica's favorite hand. A cold perfume of someone preparing for a performance. Lorenzo's boots were soundless on the runner until he reached the threshold of the main stair. The light switch near the banister was unresponsive, fingers of shadow where handprints should have been. "Sir?" A small figure materialized from the shadow of the coat closet. A maid in a gray coat too thin for winter, a damp towel wrapped in one hand. Her face was too young for the vein of steel that ran around her mouth. She set the towel down with a quietness Lorenzo was unused to in his house. She did not look at him in the way a servant looks at a master. She looked at him like someone cataloging the shape of a possibility. Her finger rose to her lips in a practiced motion. No breath, no sound. Her eyes, brown, bright, steady, held his in a way that made his chest go a lesson in surprise. "Stay silent," she mouthed, so quietly he might have mistaken it for a memory. Every instinct he had told him to yell his name, slam through the darkness, demand an explanation. Instead, he allowed the hush to hold him and let the house keep its secret for another beat. The maid Sophie, he thought. The girl he'd signed extra wages to when she cleaned his study moved like a shadow and pressed a small phone into his palm. The screen showed a live feed. The study on the second floor, curtains drawn. Veronica's voice, low and theatrical. A man's silhouette, broad and impatient, leaned in. "Luca, they put on mourning," Veronica whispered. "They sing the dirge, while we take the pieces. Mayor, press, sympathy. Lorenzo will be a ghost, and we'll be the reality." Lorenzo let the words land without flinching. He had known ambition in Veronica as he had known the hardness of the marble in the foyer, permanent, polished, dangerous. Still, the casualness the way she used his name like a ledger entry stung in a way threats never did. "Sophie, no." The maid who called herself Sophie pressed the pad of her finger to the phone's glass and widened her eyes toward the stairs. "They've already moved men to the back. Cameras looped. The gate. 2 trucks parked low. They wait," she mouthed. "Funeral is for show." A laugh that was not a laugh glanced across his face. "You're not afraid," he said, the words almost a question. She didn't answer aloud. Instead, she slid further into the shadow and, with a small, sure movement, peeled off the waitress apron to reveal a threadbare jacket beneath and, at the shoulder, a sliver of a tattoo-on emblem Lorenzo recognized from old photographs of a man who had once been close to the Romanos. An idiot's memory had not been all wasted. She was more than a maid. "Come Leona," she said finally, the sound steady as a metronome. Her voice betrayed no tremor. "Sophie is for the house. Leona is for the street." A ghost of a smile crossed Lorenzo's mouth. He had always loved names the way they could be armor or confession. He had also loved the luxury of surprise. Tonight, someone had beaten him at that. But he did not fumble. He slid back into the shadow of the columns and listened. Above, Veronica's voice kept weaving the performance. "We will read his life. We'll lay lilies. We'll make the cameras cry for him. You have the men, Luca." Enough to make a scene. Luca's answer came, gruff with overconfidence. "By the time anyone figures out he's missing, we'll have signatures on every ledger you've wanted." "Every ledger," Veronica breathed. The word like a promise of consumption. "By the time the city sobs, we will already have what we need." The house pulsed in Lorenzo's chest like a living thing. Betrayal had a sound. The soft clink of a glass slid back into place. The faint tap of a cigarette put down in anger. He thought of the times he had trusted Veronica eating dinners under the soft gold of candlelight, sharing plans that were less than confessions, the way she animated a map like a woman grooming a prize horse. He thought of Luca, standing at his right hand for years, the man who had sworn fealty with blood and kept it when it suited him. He thought of the small acts of service that kept his empire smooth. Clean shoes, warmed baths, reports finished on time, all woven into a life that could be unstitched with the right blade. "How many?" he asked, silent, a question for the girl who had pressed a phone to his palm. "Too many to beat at the gate," she mouthed. "Not enough to hold the house. They're taking inside. They've got party lines to everyone who'll stand on stage and cry for you." They wanted to look real. He eased backward, watching the curve of the staircase, the landing where the study door stood. The house no longer felt like a haven. It felt like a trap that had been made with thoughtful hands. "Why?" he asked, even though he knew. She met his eyes with a steadiness that suggested she had rehearsed the answer. "Because it's how the world works. Sometimes people build a way to climb over you when you're not looking." Her jaw tightened. "My brother Salvatore's boy, he went missing because of a push. They didn't look, so I learned how to be small until I needed to be loud." Lorenzo's brain catalogued this. A brother in the Roma, a debt of blood, a skill set that explained sensible things like an unflinching hand and the way she watched the pattern of the house. All of it fit together like the last pieces of a puzzle he'd seen in the back of his mind and never named. He had choices. He could go upstairs, throw open the study, and make a scene. Gamble on his bulk and the gravity his name still commanded. Or he could accept that the house, for the moment, belonged to others and move the battle where it favored him. He lowered himself into the groove Leona offered without asking. "Lead," he said, and the two of them moved as if the house itself exhaled in relief. She navigated the servants' hall with the assurance of a woman who had learned the estate by scent and scrape. The world of servants existed in heritage and in secrets. A pantry door that avoided the main corridor. A staff stair behind an old pantry. A passage between walls used at Christmas to hide presents. Leona's hands found them all, and each discovery she made was a chisel mark against the assumption that one thing would always hold. They reached a door at the back of the house, a hatch set low in the wall. Leona produced a key with the reverence of someone who had held a map to a treasure chest. The hatch did not swing open. It bowed like something that had been given up on a long time ago. The air that spilled out was cool and smelled of the river and oil, an old iron-on underbelly of the city, tucked beneath the estate. It smelled like a place where secrets could be buried. "We can't be seen leaving," she said. "Not tonight." They filmed the road. They owned the crescents, with men in plain cars. The hatch let them down into dampness and darkness. For a heartbeat, Lorenzo hesitated, feeling the old, soft thud of his heart as if it were a drum beaten for a last song. Pride lay like armor, and also like a chain. He felt it loosen. They throated through a narrow tunnel that had been meant for drainage, not escape, a place where the house exhaled into the city. Drops of water clung to their shoulders. The light from his phone painted their faces in gold. At one point, Leona pressed him against the stone and tilted her head, listening. He could hear faint voices, men muttering, the metallic creak of equipment. He had imagined a scream, a confrontation. Instead, there was ordinary movement, dutiful and efficient. A funeral requires organization. When they emerged, it was into a back alley that reeked of fried oil and damp cardboard. The other side of the estate, a block away. Their path now a web of alleys and service roads that snaked through warehouses and shuttered storefronts. Leona had a battered Honda waiting under tarps and crates, old, reliable, the kind of car whose history was known to a mechanic's hands. She slid into the driver's seat with the ease of someone who had driven when everything in the world depended on not being seen. Lorenzo watched her really looked tanned. The small reveal of a girl who had once been invisible became something else. A weapon honed into purpose. He wondered what had taught her to be so unafraid. He did not ask. There would be time to know. The Honda started with a cough and a sputter, then a willing growl. They moved out into a city that had already been told a story. Their job was to not fit into the paragraphs Veronica had already bought. The rain turned the night into a sheet of moving glass. Headlights smeared into halos. Lorenzo tucked his hands under his coat, feeling each bone ache with the taste of being outmaneuvered. He had weathered more than this. He had endured knockdowns, some deserved, some not. But the sting of being planned against, the civility of a staged funeral, felt crueler than bullets. "Who tipped them?" he asked, a question balanced on curiosity and fury. Leona's jaw flexed. "You'd have to ask a man who liked lists," she said, "but I don't think it came from outside the house." It came from the house. He had suspected as much. Business moves were often a circle of family and friends, drying out power through social rituals. Veronica had always loved the theater of grief, the way cameras bent to be softened by her face. To have her use it as a stage was a betrayal one he felt in the soft tissue of his trust. Their escape did not go unnoticed. Within the quarter-mile of their exit, taillights multiplied like a rash. The first car was an ugly sedan that didn't bother to hide its speed. Men inside wore coats collar high and phones held like talismans. A shot cracked across the night. The Honda's rear window exploded into a fan of glass, a sound like something slicing fabric. "Mavi," Leona snapped, and the car lunged. He didn't need to be told twice. He had been shot at before, in the way violence leaves a residue in the nervous system. Bullets thudded against metal, pinged harmlessly. The wet roads made each maneuver riskier. But Leona turned corners with a knowledge that suggested she had chased and been chased in cities that had no mercy. She took an alley that should have been closed and threaded the Honda through a flurry of delivery trucks and puddles, her hands small and sure on the wheel. They were not alone. Lights shadowed. There's another car to the left, a van to the right. The city conspired with the night's rain. Each turn sprayed light into the other vehicle's mirrors and made it impossible for distant pursuers to keep a clean line. Leona's face was the picture of grim concentration. A woman whose mask had become the serious school of survival. A spray of bullets hit the left fender. The Honda shuddered like an animal. He thought then, with a flash of the old man who had taught him to be patient, of the currency of time, how being alive bought you options you might squander. He looked at Leona, at the curve of her mouth, and understood that she had traded a sister's safety for skill. That thought hardened him. They made the industrial belt by the river warehouses like teeth, shuttered and sleeping. Here, the city's sighs were muffled, and the rain fell with less ceremonious applause. A sound like a helicopter hummed above, distant and indifferent. The men who followed them did not seem intent on taking the risk of a full-on shootout. Instead, they maneuvered, cut off ramps, put their cars into positions meant to herd. People who know how to hunt know how to box prey into corridors. Leona set the Honda into a forgotten lot behind an old factory, its brick walls scalloped with soot. The place had been an assembly plant once. Now it was a hollow that coughed up glass and rusted machinery. She killed the engine, and the car breathed like a lung. They sat in the dark for a moment, the rain a curtain beyond the broken roof. Lorenzo listened for their pursuers, as if listening to the wind for a fault line. "They know the house," he said at last. "They know how we move." She nodded. "They've got footage. Someone sold them the story that you were gone. They want a memorial they can control." "And what of Luca?" he asked. "Is he the hand or the face?" She considered. "Both, maybe. Luca wants land. Veronica wants the audience that confirms her. They both want what they can wear." "Smart," he said. "Dangerous." They moved like ghosts through the factory, small and silent and careful. Lorenzo's eye caught the outline of machines once used to press metal into parts. Their mouths were open, dark as graves. He had always been a man of rooms and checks and numbers. Now he found solace in the simple arithmetic of survival. Numbers of men, positions of cars, the willingness of a rival to turn up muscle for price. They found, hidden behind an old packing press, a stair that led up to a loft. It smelled of oil and old paper. Leona's shoulders did not rigid. "We can hide here," she said. "We can move while they watch the theater they've set." "How many men do they have in the house?" he asked. Enough to control the grounds and make most of the cameras echo a loop. Not enough to hold the city, but they don't need to. They only need to make the city believe you are lost. He thought of the cameras, of the way a city can be led by what it sees. Veronica's theater would need the gullibility of the press, the choreography of the mourners, voices that could be rented with the right kind of pressure. That they had already moved men into position told him the plan was further along than he'd hoped. Leona produced a small, cracked radio and tuned it to a frequency. For a while, only static returned the favor. Then, faint and a beat ahead of time, came the sound that made him shift his weight. Footsteps on metal. Clinking chain. That cheap laugh Luca used when he thought he owned the joke. They're sweeping the perimeter, Leona whispered. They'll come in if they have to. Or they'll wait until tomorrow and let the city swallow you as memory. The factory was not a place for better armor only, for tactics. Lorenzo's old teacher, the man who had first taught him to read faces and ledger books, had once said that dignity is the last thing a man should ever throw away. Yet, dignity could be a currency in wrong change. He had a mansion to the east that would be given away like a hat if he did not act. He had a woman who smiled like malice and a man who was greedy for more than he deserved. Do you know Salvatore? He asked, watching the rain through the broken rafters as if he could order the weather. Leona's face flinched, so slightly he might have missed it. I know his family. Salvatore was always a businessman who kept his books tidy. They say he likes directness. Does he like favors? Salvatore likes honesty, she said, and enough muscle exchanged for territory makes anyone honest. It was an old arrangement, power traded for power. The city partitioned like land between oak and highway. Lorenzo had never been eager to cede ground. Pride sometimes looks like a child refusing to give up a toy. But he had never been a man who let the toy mean the world when the world itself was at stake. There would be bargains. There would be prices paid. There would be choices that morning's lilies would not hide. They kept to the shadows until the last of the city's curiosity filtered by, until the night grazed toward a bleak, watery dawn. At some point, Leona took out a burner phone, had been folded into her sleeve, a device that might as well have been carved from bone. She typed "thumb" among others' lives, and then handed the device to Lorenzo. The call did not ring long before a low voice answered, the kind of voice that folded centuries into consonants. Salvatore Romanos had practiced patience until it was polished, and now he sounded like a man who expected everything to cost something. Lorenzo Salvare said. The name was a greeting and a ledger entry. You are an early riser. I am alive, Lorenzo said. He did not offer the explanation that he had been betrayed from within the house. That was a ledger item to disclose later, preferably over a table with olives and a bottle poured for two. They are staging a funeral for me. Silence ran like a thread for a moment. A funeral before a body, Salvatore said finally. They're theatrical these days. Who plays the dead? Veronica and Luca are writing the script, Lorenzo replied. He let the weight of the names fall without the edge of accusation. Salvatore would want the facts, not the fever. And you? Salvatore asked. I want my house, Lorenzo said. I want the men who sold themselves to my wife's plans accounted for. I want an end that keeps the city in balance. You want what everyone in our business wants when the sands shift. Not a war with mines everywhere, but a correction that everyone can stomach. The voice was patient, almost amused. You should come to the docks. We will talk. Lorenzo felt the tilt of the night settle into a new direction. He had rarely asked for assistance. He had rarely made bargains that cost land. But the city was not a chessboard for a single pair of hands. Bloodlines and contracts made maps. He had to choose what he would lose and what he would keep. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Leona. Her fingers brushed his, a small contact, and the briefness of the touch was a pact in itself. For the time being, she said, we go to the docks. Salvatore's men can smell the tide on you and decide if they want your company. They moved like two shadows that had no past to admit. The rain eased to a steady whisper. The city had not yet decided whether to be outraged or just bored. Somewhere, the sound of a funeral hymn started to rise. In the distance, someone tuning rehearsal for tomorrow's tears. Veronica's voice would be gentle and precise. She always had the air of someone who knew how to make grief wearable. As they drove toward the river, Lorenzo allowed himself a thought he had been avoiding. The choker, not the trinket itself, the diamond circlet Veronica had always paraded like a banner, but the symbolism of it. It had been bought as a token of something he had believed he could provide. Safety, status, an answer for the city's mouth. For Veronica, it had been a weapon. Leona's gaze cut to him as they crossed a bridge that shook with the night's wind. She put on a necklace and tell the cameras her grief, she said. She'll show you as a martyr to the world and a vacuum for the ambitious. The choker will be sold as evidence of love, or as evidence of theater, Lorenzo muttered. He imagined Veronica's hands at the rehearsal, the soft placement of fabric, the way she might practice sobs in glassy silence. Men like him learned to see the theater. He had not expected his wife to build it so carefully. The docks were a place where the city had forgotten to be polite. Rusted cranes stood like sentries, and warehouses hunched against the water. A neon sign hummed that read Romanos and Sons Shipping, the kind of helpful advertisement that told you the world's divisions had names. Salvatore's men waited with the orderly patience of accountants. They were scrubbed and practical. Their violence looked like budget lines. A car idled in the shadow. A man emerged with the slow dignity of dominance. His eyes scanned Lorenzo as if closing a book. He was not Salvatore, but he had Salvatore's economy of motion. When the man spoke into a radio, he said, "He's here." Lorenzo felt the old taste of power as a question mark. He had called on a rival. Rivals were good at making deals because they kept a ledger of needs. Salvatore would not give him absolution for free. Someone would pay, in acres or in men. He stepped from the car into the wet cold, and the man's shadow fell over him. "Mr. Viti," the man said. "Don Romano waits. He says you choose words over fire tonight." Lorenzo's mouth curved the smallest bit. "He always did favor sentences," he said. "Bring me to him." They walked toward the light of an office, where the sound of the river beat against old glass. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and ink. Lorenzo took in the arrangement, the way the furniture sat as a chessboard. The photograph of Salvatore smiling at younger, leaner men. The fact that the docks hummed with economy while the rest of the city rehearsed a funeral for a man who still breathed. "You have an offer?" Salvatore asked without standing, his hands resting on a desk that had seen many papers signed. Lorenzo thought of his house and how many men had been stationed inside. He thought of Veronica's hands, folded as if in prayer. He thought of Luca's hunger. He would not leave any of this to the mercy of rumor. He had to buy a chance to cut the rut away. "I will trade territory," he said. "A slice of the south side for a day of muscle. You take Luca? You take his men. You keep the land as part of the arrangement." Salvatore weighed the words as if they were coins. "You give land when pride burns," he said softly. "You always had too much faith in your walls, Lorenzo." Lorenzo's laugh was brief. "Then take what you need." "But I want my house. I want Veronica to answer the city for what she staged. A public humiliation, Salvatore Musido. That is expensive. It costs reputation. It costs time. It costs friends." "And you?" Lorenzo asked. "What do you want in return?" Salvatore's eyes were a ledger. Hard to read, easier for the man across the desk to misjudge. "Some territories, a border that makes sense on paper and in practice, a favor that lands in my pocket and keeps my son safe. We both lose something. Lorenzo, you may keep more than your dignity if you choose wisely." Lorenzo imagined the cost laid across the map in his head. Pockets given, soldiers he could see the funerals, the press, Veronica's theatrical sorrow turned into signage of her betrayal. He could see Luca's arrogance folded like paper and given to another man's hands. He could see the choker lying in the bottom of a box, the diamond, a cold sun. "Give me 48 hours, Lorenzo said. "I need to be in a place where I look like what I am. Alive." Salvatore's smile did not reach his eyes. 48 hours sounds like the price of a small life. "Make it 24, Lorenzo countered. "You will have your answer sooner." Salvatore weighed that, then nodded. 24. he said. But remember, favors accrue interest. As they spoke, the city's lights reflected on the river in small, trembling coins. Somewhere, on an early night rehearse, actors practiced grief. Lorenzo had set into motion a plan that would cost him acreage and peace. He had accepted the architecture of survival, give land, take back respect. He had traded a map for a ladder. He had chosen to make a bargain with the man who liked his books, tidy. Leona watched from the doorway, her jaw a tight line. She had left something behind in the house. A name on a list. A camera loop that would unravel or hold. She had taken a risk not because she believed in Lorenzo's rightness, she understood the man too well for blind faith, but because a man who had been told to be dead could not let his city be rearranged by theater. Her reasons were private and sharp and kept like knives in the sleeve of her past. "Do you trust him?" she asked, once they were back in the Honda, the docks receding in their rear view, like a promise or a threat. Lorenzo considered. Trust was a small and dangerous coin. "I trust that he keeps a ledger," he said, "and that he knows the value of an agreement." Leona's mouth quirked. "Books are blank until someone decides what goes in the margins." They drove through the city on tires, toward a hotel that smelled of bleach and held enough anonymity to be useful. People in masks of mourning would wake to a headline that promised spectacle. Veronica would rehearse her lines. Luca would button his coat and prepare to taste power. The city was a theater in which everyone had to play a part. Tonight, Lorenzo was not a corpse, but a man planning his return. They checked into a room that did not ask for his signature and paid cash that left no prints. The windows looked over a street that could not remember anyone until it had to. Leona took the bed by the bathroom, her back to the wall, a posture of a woman who guarded small things. Lorenzo set his jaw and let his breath out slowly, counting the ways his life might be remade. The night was not restful. His phone hummed with a list of names: counsel, men, the odd journalist who called with the hunger of vultures sensing blood. Veronica's name sat like a smudge. He had always known that marriage was not a fortress. It was a mutual agreement, a smuggling of loneliness for companionship. Tonight, that smuggling had been exposed. At dawn, the city would know him as missing. At dusk, he would be at a funeral recitation of his own absence. In between, he would be making trades and setting traps that did not require a body to be present on a slab for them to work. Leona planned and moved with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to be invisible until it became useful. She checked the feeds he had asked her to keep. She had a list that would look like an inventory. Cameras looped, men scheduled, places where wires ran into false walls. There were small things. She did not tell him how she had once sat in the back of a church and noticed the way a mourner wiped her face, how she had learned to read the cadence of weeping. Those were tools no man taught you. Those were the instruments that taught you to find the moment when a room is most vulnerable. They slept in fits, half-watches, and practical naps. The city outside took a breath and readied itself for the spectacle Veronica intended to perform. He could feel the current of 1,000 eyes being guided toward a stage she had set. The idea of being displayed as lost when he was alive tasted of betrayal and farce. When morning light bled through the cheap curtains of the hotel, Leona woke with a small, sharp plan. "I can get into the house long enough to plant a hole in the loop," she said, grim and practical. "Not enough to take control, just enough to make someone question a feed." "It is risky," Lorenzo said. "Everything we do is," she answered. The clarity in her voice argued as if speaking was a thing that trimmed down fear. He looked at her, at the small patient face hardened into resolve. For a long moment he simply watched the rain dry in the city's gutters. He thought of his options like coins on a table. He would pay, and the world would move. He would give land and take back loyalty. He would exile his wife's ambition and hand it to someone who could use it. He would call in a favor and let the rival keep a pocket of earth in exchange for muscle that would return him traction. They returned to the estate in the thin of the day, when the funeral industry begins to rehearse and the city's eyes are still unaware. Leona moved like a woman who had once been required to be small and had kept the knowledge of being big in her back pocket. She stepped into the house as if the rugs were her floor and laid a small trail of signals he would not notice unless he was listening. The servants looked at her with a mixture of surprise and relief. Some had always suspected that the quiet girl who took their coats knew more than she admitted. Others looked away. Fear has a way of making people polite. Upstairs, Veronica paced like a woman who had practiced grief into a cadence. She had her best dress ready, pearls looped like the rings of authority she wanted to wear. Luca stood a pace behind her, too eager to master the art of clothes as armor. He would grow into the arrogance of men who had learned the easiest way to rule, to take what is not bolted down and call it justice. They had not yet seen Leona as anything but a maid. That assumption was the instrument of their downfall. The maid who had urged him to stay silent now moved through the house with the quiet steps of someone setting a stage to collapse. She left a small, almost negligible mark on a file in the study, shifted a camera's angle by a hair, introduced a little static to a feed. Mistakes can be deliberate. People who never expected to be watched do not always prepare for the quiet subversions of those underfoot. Luca leaned over the study table and spread out papers with the breath of a man tasting the smell of victory. He counted men like a miser counts coins. Veronica watched him with the flaxen patience of a woman already signing for a prize. They were both children playing at the seriousness of watchful men. "They'll come for the head," he said aloud, loud enough for Lorenzo to feel the words through the floorboards. "They will weep for the head," Veronica corrected with a teacher's smile. "And they will never see their hands being taken." From the landing, Lorenzo watched them for a heartbeat, his breath steady. The rage that sat in him was a contained thing, like a beast in a well. It needed release, but only with direction. He had choices, and he had time measured in small, cunning increments. He could step out now and take them in the light, humiliate them with his physical self. Or he could do what the city often did not expect from a man of his stature. He could vanish like a rumor and let the world participate in its own discomfort. He descended the stairs, not with a shout, but with the quiet that had first been given to him in an alleyway as a frightened youth. He stood at the base of the banister and waited as if waiting were its own weapon. Veronica finally spoke, a speech rehearsed in the mirror. "Tomorrow we will honor a man who stood for us," she said, her voice making a small, perfect cut. "Ibum in absentia. His legacy will be with us. He gave us everything, and we will take a moment to show we will hold on." The words landed like soft stones on water. The press would swallow them with appetite. The city would cry for the man who was not dead yet. The play was set. Lorenzo stepped forward, and for an instant the room's air shifted, not because he made a noise, but because presence is heavier than any set of words. Veronica's face tightened. Luca's hand dropped to the handle of a pistol that he had learned to like for its promise rather than its burden. The servants gasped, a small collective sound that dragged attention like a net. Lorenzo did not shout. He did not call a menacing name. He allowed his eyes to do part of the work, slow and exact. "Good morning," he said, and his voice had the weight of a verdict. Veronica's posture broke like glass. Luca's hand belt looped, uncertain whether to reach for violence or for the protection of surprise. Lorenzo let his eyes do the work, slow and unforgiving. The servants' gasps braided through the room like a chorus. Veronica's face folded first into white, then into something far colder, calculating damage control. Luca's hand hovered, indecisive, over his belt. The room could have erupted. It did not. Lorenzo spoke as if reading from a ledger he had opened for the first time. "You staged my absence to sell the city a story," he said. His voice did not need to be loud. It needed to be precise. "You sell grief, Veronica. Luca, you sell certainty. Both of you sell other people's trust." Veronica's smile trained, perfect, slipped into something real. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said, and the words were the defense of a woman caught on stage without a script. "We had to protect the business while you—" Her eyes searched his, looking for the version of Lorenzo who could be bargained with, but found only the quiet man who had learned to count betrayals like interest. "You taught them how to cry," he said. "You taught them what to say, so cameras would swallow the lies. Does flattering the press feel like power, love?" She flinched, not from the question, but from the honesty of the accusation. Luca found his mouth first. "You're playing at theatrics, Lorenzo, this is our chance. This is your chance to be something else, Lorenzo said, stepping up a pace that made the room shrink. You chose a stage. You will take the consequences. It was not a threat in the theatrical sense. It was a practical movement toward unmaking the plan. He could have stayed, dragged them into a scene of ruin, exposed them to a servant or two, and unstitched Veronica's network in a heartbeat. But Salvatore's bargain hummed in his mind, the muscle exchanged for territory, and he would not squander leverage on a kitchen floor humiliation when the city itself could witness the truth. He understood theater. He also understood spectacle's value when used for retribution. Give me until the funeral, he said without drama. Let them file their lies tomorrow. I will return when the light is on them. Veronica blinked, pink rising under the skin of her cheek. Return? After what She couldn't finish. Her theater had expected him to be absent. It had not anticipated the possibility of his reappearance as a timed performance. Luca laughed. Brittle. You want to make a scene, boss? Make your scene now. What are you afraid of? Your own people. Lorenzo's hand brushed the banister. He thought of the cameras, the looped feeds Leona had whispered about, the men already being shifted into place like furniture. He thought of Salvatore's offer and the arithmetic of bargaining. I'm not afraid, he said. I'm calculating. And you, he added, turning his gaze to Veronica, are going to learn that the camera is not always loyal to the person who poses. Veronica's mouth thinned. For a sliver of a second, she looked like she might strike him. And then she remembered how much she had already promised the wrong people. Instead, she turned, suddenly theatrical once more, smoothing her dress into the shape of mourning. We will honor what he gave, she said loudly, for the servants to hear. We will grieve for the family. For the servants bowed, some from lifelong habit, some because fear and habit were the same coin. Lorenzo allowed the moment to close, then stepped back into the shadow he had been born to inhabit. He had not exposed them publicly, but he had introduced the possibility that he was not yet a memory. That seed of doubt would, if tended, poison Veronica's narrative. Later, in the Honda, as the rain had softened to a gray memory, Leona watched him in the rearview mirror and asked the question that had been waiting. Why not take them now? Because the truth is more valuable when everyone is convinced of its opposite, he said. Humiliation inside the house will be a private thing. A public correction is a reset. If Salvatore honors his part, Luca doesn't just lose. She's moved. You're trading land for a reputation? She said. That is brave or foolish. It is business, he answered. And sometimes business takes scalpel work, not hammers. They drove into the walnut light of a city that never consented to pity. In a hotel room that smelled of bleach and stale coffee, Lorenzo counted names while Leona went over the list of the house's cameras and the feeds she could nudge loose. She had a plan to do more than question. She could open a space in the loop, large enough for something real to arrive. She didn't call it hacking. She called it knowing where the hinges were. They moved with the silence of people who had learned to be careful in crowded rooms. Leona's list was long and precise. Which cameras looped? Which gate was watched by plainclothes men? Which neighbor liked to sweep the hedges at noon? She hadn't invented skills overnight. Bits of her past, an angry brother, swallowed by the city's undercurrents, driving lessons purchased with odd jobs in alleys. Nights spent memorizing the names of trucks game together, like the stitches in a net. They were not miracles, they were practice. Tomorrow, Leona said, voice low like the rustle of mechanics. When they make you a ghost, Veronica will expect a body absent in the room. She won't expect you to show them what alive looks like. And the cameras? Lorenzo asked. I will make them question what they see, she said. Not fix it entirely. We need them to witness what everyone will remember. He looked at her as if reading a page he'd only glimpsed. I never thought the house would hide a weapon in a maid. She shrugged. Not like a girl who'd hidden herself, but like someone who'd learned the value of being underestimated. They never do. When night fell, they moved. Leona slipped back into the estate before dawn, a whisper where the wind had learned to keep its own counsel. The staff, those who were not in on the bigger picture, went about their rehearsals, practiced sobs, printed programs that smelled of ink and linen, remuging arrangements. Veronica supervised the floral arrangements as a woman who was arranging trophies, not bouquets. Luca rehearsed shakes of hands and the bark of a man who had practiced grief as one practices a new uniform. Leona's small disruptions were surgical and extra loop inserted here. A camera angle tugged a fraction there. A feed given enough static for technicians to blame an electrical short. She crept through the bones of the house with the surety of a woman who had walked every corridor in seasons of fear and vigilance. A maid is taught to notice what others do not want to see, and Leona used that training to write a few uncertain notes into the night's broadcast. When the time came, the press took their seats and prepared to swallow the same lines they'd been fed for a week. Mourning had become a service you could outsource, and Veronica had signed the contract. Camera crews clicked, lenses like teeth, eager to feed the city's appetite for spectacle. Politicians practiced the right face. Reporters memorized the names they were permitted to say. The house stood like a theater, and everyone in it understood their cues. Leona, however, had rewritten the cues. At precisely the hour when Veronica's speech reached the part she had practiced in mirrors, the house went dark. Not the theatrical darkness Veronica wanted soft, planned, but a clean, total blackout that swallowed faces and made microphones hiss like startled birds. Gasps and the rustle of dresses rose to fill the paused silence. Leona had done what she said she would. She had made technicians uneasy, the feed uncertain. She had not broken systems so much as given them a moment of plausible failure. A blackout in a house where the cameras expected a lit ceremonial is not a mere hiccup. It is an opening. Then, amid the confusion, the stage-right spotlight that Veronica had arranged to fall on her hand as she placed the choker at the center of her speech snapped to life. It fell instead on the stairwell where the curtains pooled, and into that beam stepped Lorenzo, mud streaked down his coat, a bandage at his temple, clothes that spoke of travel through wrong places. He did not walk like a man pretending to be wounded, but like a man who had earned a wound. For a breathless moment the house did not understand what the eye had just witnessed. Veronica's exultation became a child's bewilderment. Luca's smile cracked. The press stammered. The microphones picked up the new sound better than anybody expected. The rustle of truth landing. Lorenzo descended as if he owned the steps he had not walked down for a night that had counted him as a ghost. His presence was both accusation and punctuation. He let his eyes sweep the crowd, the mayor, the reporters, the men who had taken stock of power and skeleton contracts, and land on Veronica. "Good afternoon," he said, and the voice traced through the house like a blade made of silk. "I attended a funeral rehearsal. I decided to attend the performance." Veronica's face unmade itself. She lunged in emotion, theatrical and immediate, but the room had been primed by Leona to see how her theatrics had been arranged. The cameras, coaxed into a moment of doubt, pulled back like a net losing its catch. The feed that had been looped elsewhere in the house rebroadcast as static, and the only live line was the spotlight and the stairwell. Salvatore's men were there, as agreed, stern, economical. They had traded muscle for maps, and they were ready to collect their debt. At Lorenzo's first step, two of them moved with the smoothness of accountants turning a page. One took Luca by the arm before his hands could find the comfort of a gun. It was a respectful, efficient, take down, no blood, no theater, just the business of reassigning a problem to a man who paid for it. Mr. Viti, the lead of Salvatore's contingent, said in a voice that had been taught to make announcements without emotion. "Don Romano would like his thanks noted. He takes the men you offered and the debts that come with them." Luca's face went from indignation to the white of a man who understands a debt has been called due. He was escorted out with the quiet of someone taken to a bench to sign papers he had not read. Veronica, meanwhile, tried to salvage the script of her life. "This is she began. And then she stopped because the room had already been taught to watch how her eyes avoided the cameras that were now following the stairwell more than her. "I have no wish to kill a marriage on a stage," Lorenzo said, and he let those words hang so the cameras could catch the nuance. "But I do have a wish to know who will perform for truth when it is offered. Who will stand for the city that builds us?" She vomited half words, The press pressed forward like dogs to a scent. The mayor, trapped between the need for an image and the necessity of practical alliances, found himself uncomfortably shifted. People who had rehearsed grief now found that grief had become a liability. After Luca's men were taken away, Salvatore's lieutenant turned to Veronica and offered a small mercy. "Leave with dignity," he said, cold. "Leave with a few possessions. Anything else will be taken as payment." Veronica's face pitched between indignation and calculation. She made one last plea, a practiced sob, meant to draw eyes and pity. But the room had been taught to see through rehearsed tears. This was not because Lorenzo had spoken truth alone, it was because Leona had rerouted the narrative, so that the cameras saw the man who had been declared dead alive before the world had agreed to mourn. The audience did not know who to trust anymore, and in that mistrust, Veronica found her authority. In those last moments, Lorenzo stepped down to the foot of the stair and removed his coat, unbuttoning a sleeve to reveal a small scrabble of mud and the faint sheen of exertion. Veronica, always keen on symbolism, reached instinctively for the choker at her throat, the jewel that had been bought not as an adornment but as an instrument of public ownership. Lorenzo's hand moved like a man who knew when to reclaim an object. He plucked the choker from her with a gentleness that might have been an apology. No one moved to stop him. Everyone had been waiting to see what he would do. "You always liked the ornaments," he said softly to Veronica, then turned, offering the choker to Leona. She stepped into the lights beside him, no longer the invisible seam of the house, but a woman who had made the stage crumble. Leona took the choker in her hand, an object of light and a reminder of the transaction of power. She held it as if weighing a coin. For a heartbeat, the room waited for a scene. Would she accept a token and be bought in? Would she curtsy to the ladder of status? Then she did something no one expected. She tied the choker back into a small velvet box and handed it to Lorenzo instead. "This belongs where it means something," she said, voice steady like stone. "Not on someone who prefers to perform grief." Lorenzo's fingers closed around the box. It was a small exchange. One jewel moved from the neck of a woman to a man's hand, but it was larger in meaning. The choker had been a trophy of consumption. Now it would be a symbol in a different ledger. Salvatore's men took Luca and his lieutenants away without fanfare. Veronica, exiled in the public eye and stripped of the control she'd pretended to own, was escorted from the room. She left with a face practiced to command pity, but pity requires belief, and the city's belief had been fractured. When the crowd dispersed, when the cameras roamed for a story that fit their appetite, Lorenzo and Leona stood in the quiet that followed a storm. The house smelled of lilies and spilled perfume, the scent of performance and now of exposure. There was something like exhaustion in Lorenzo's shoulders. "You played it perfectly," he said to Leona, but it was not praise so much as an acknowledgement. "You wrote a hole where one was needed." She shrugged as if the night had been routine, but this night had rewritten both their lives. Leona had stopped being a seam and started being a hinge. The bargain with Salvatore closed in an office across the river where ink and paper still mattered. Landlines exchanged for men. Men traded for a public correction. Salvatore's terms were neat and economical and reminded Lorenzo of that fact he had always known. Power was a set of accounts and someone always read the numbers. "You give ground to stand," Salvatore said at the final signing, as if offering a maxim rather than an observation. "You keep your house. You keep your name. You lose acreage, but you gain a cleaner circle." Lorenzo accepted the map of loss. He paid the price with a map of neighborhoods and a few small intersections that meant more to a rival than to him. The city rearranged itself a little and moved on. Men traded hands like the moving of fences. It was messy. It was practical. And it was the kind of solution both men respected. What happened to Veronica was public because the city wanted a narrative. She was not jailed. She was not killed. She was escorted out with the dignity of someone granted an unkind mercy. Exile. She moved to a place where her name could not be a constant headline and where she might, perhaps, learn that power bought with the labor of other people's belief tends to fail. For Leona, the night had been quieter and more consequential. Lorenzo recognized that competence in a way that had nothing to do with titles. At the docks, in the office where Salvatore's men had stood in a tidy line, Lorenzo offered her a position that had not existed for her when she started as Sophie the maid. "You did more than keep me alive," he said when he offered her the title. "You saved me from a narrative that would have stripped everything we have." Leona's face gave nothing away. "I don't need a title for what I did," she said. "I know." He smiled then. "A small thing," and reached into his pocket. He placed the velvet box with the choker on the table between them. "I want you at my side. Not because I need someone to look after me, but because I need someone who will speak when things get tidy." She opened the box, looked at the jewels, and then at him. "I don't want a necklace," she said, and the words cut through the room like an exactness. "I want a voice." "So do I," he replied. "Consider this the first payment." She took the offer and, after a pause, accepted the role he offered, a position that was not simply ceremonial but one that carried responsibility, and the kind of respect that had nothing to do with silk. He named her consigliere informally at first, no letter, no ribbon, but the title was weight enough. In their world, respect could be formalized later. Deeds mattered more now. The weeks that followed were a slow arithmetic of reconstruction. Men who had been loyal for the right reasons asked questions. Those who had been loyal for the wrong reasons took their leave or were quietly extracted. Lorenzo tightened the circle. He kept some friends, sent others to farms and quiet houses, and made clear that the Viti name would not be used as a stage 4 private ambition again. Leona moved into a different house, one that smelled less of lilies and more of leather and coffee. She brought with her a few small items from her previous life: an apron, a radio, and left behind the tired anonymity she had worn so well. Her brother's absence remained a hollow, but now she could buy small measures of security, send money to a family, and, most importantly, speak when needed. The city responded as cities do, with gossip at first, then with the steady work of forgetting. Politicians found new friends. The press found the next story. Lorenzo kept watch, not because he needed to clutch power like a cherished coin, but because he understood that his position was as much about stewardship as it was about strength. 6 months later, the transformation announced itself in a room of lights. A gala was arranged at the estateless for display and more as a demonstration that the house could still host without being a stage for betrayals. Guests came in suits and careful smiles. The mayor attended, partly out of habit and partly because the city liked to be seen with the right houses. Don Salvatore did not come. He sent a respectable silhouette of a man instead, a gesture of mutual acknowledgement rather than ongoing conflict. Leona walked into the room with a quiet authority. She wore a dress that fit like a promise, and at her throat glinted the choker she had refused in private but later accepted as a symbol of the position she'd earned. Not as a jewel to buy silence, but as a token of a life rearranged. The diamond sat not like a trophy, but like an emblem. The old order given a new name. People noticed, of course. They have to. The press lurked at the edges, hungry for narrative. But the story they wanted, a maid who rose, because she seduced power, would not hold in the face of what they'd seen. Leona's rise had been earned in the corridors where people spoke quietly, and in a factory, where men learned that explosions of smoke were less persuasive than the slow economy of truth. The city would take its time, but the arc was visible enough that those who looked could see the lines. Lorenzo moved through the room like a man who had learned to recalibrate his pride. He stood beside Leona when introductions were necessary and let her speak to the crowd when the matter required precision. The two of them, once master and servant by the accident of birth and class, now presented as equals with a shared understanding. He did not try to make her a prize to be displayed. She did not attempt to craft his shadow into something new. They existed together with a deliberate economy of power. A reporter touched the choker with the tip of a question, then framed it as a line in a profile rather than a scandal. "You must have been surprised," she asked Leona later, when cameras were off and the room had turned to the hum of smoke. Leona smiled, a little tired. "I was taught to stay small," she said. "But I learned to see what people forgot to hide. That taught me how to say when to be silent and when not to be." She had once told Lorenzo, in the foyer on that rain-slick night, to stay silent. The moment had saved his life. It had also been an invitation. The truth that stunned the city had not been only that he was alive. It was that the person everyone had ignored was the instrument that had kept him breathing. The shock people felt in the weeks after the funeral was not merely because a man had walked back into a room. It was because the world had been told that the things it jewelry, cheerful displays, were not always the seedbeds of virtue. At the gala, as the orchestra lifted a minor chord, and laughter softened the edges of the night, Salvatore's lieutenant crossed the room and clinked glasses with Lorenzo. There was a mutual nod of men who had made a clean bargain. No one applauded the ceded land. It was a map now drawn on paper, not on a body, but the balance they had negotiated hummed like a newly tuned instrument. Lorenzo watched Leona move through a crowd that had once thought of her as a name on a roster. He felt a strange tenderness. Not the possessive sort, but the respect that comes from having someone stand against the commerce of lies. He had lost acreage. He had gained clarity. When the evening waned and candles gutters burned low, Leona and Lorenzo walked the garden path where the rain had first announced itself. The air smelled of wet earth and cut grass. In the faint light, the house looked less like a stage and more like something that had been rebuilt from the inside. "Do you regret the pieces you gave away?" she asked, voice soft. He considered the map he'd signed, lines inked like quick scars. "Some nights," he said, "mostly I regret the manner in which people learned to trust the wrong things." She looked up at him. "And the choker?" He touched the velvet box he'd kept in his pocket since the night he'd taken it from Veronica. "It belongs to someone who knows its weight," he said. "It taught us both something." Leona's laugh was a small thing between two people who had been through privatized storms. "I never wanted to be an ornament, Lorenzo." "No," he agreed. "You are not. You never were." In the months that followed, the Viti house returned to a quieter thread of life. Men who had been loyal for the right reasons returned. Those who had been opportunists were repositioned. Leona walked the halls no longer unseen. Her name was spoken in meetings as something practical. Influence, intelligence, the kind that kept a house from being a theater again. News cycles moved on. As they always do, Veronica's exile became a faded scandal. Luca's men found new employments or new quiet corners. Salvatore kept his portion, tidy and efficient. The city maintained its habit of making new myths while letting older ones die slow deaths. Still, every so often, someone in the estate would move the conversation to the night the house had almost eaten its master. Someone would recall a maid who pressed a finger to a man's lips and told him to stay silent. They would say her name, Sophie, a polite, domestic name, and look at the woman who was now Leona and see the difference. The house had learned, in a small, practical way, to listen to the people it had ignored. Loyalty, it seemed, could no longer be purchased with a smile and a camera. In private, Lorenzo made sure that the ledger balanced not only in land, but in people. He made amends where amends were possible and paid restitution where it could not undo harm. His code had been wounded that night. The healing came in small repairs rather than grand declarations. He found a way to keep his power from being a theater and to make it a stewardship. On a late autumn evening, a dinner with a few trusted men and women, Leona spoke a truth he had known but had not always said aloud. "We used to think silence kept us safe," she told them. "Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes it is the grammar of cowardice. Knowing which is which, that is the work." Lorenzo sat in the room listening. He thought of the boy who had driven a Civic through rain and thought unpredictability was his weapon. He thought of the woman who had stood in his doorway and told him to be quiet. He thought of the cost of being seen and the price of being invisible. The choker waited in a safe he had altered to accept other things, documents, ledgers, the small intimacies of stewardship. He had placed it there not as a symbol of conquest but as a reminder that power without accountability is a story waiting to be written by someone who knows how to set a stage. When the city asked for a story, they got one. A man who returned. A wife who staged a funeral. A maid who told him to be silent. The truth had stunned them because it was not neat, not easily digestible. Truth is seldom tidy. It is messy, costly, and requires that someone be willing to stand in the light and tell it. Leona had done so first by urging silence when silence saved a life, then by refusing silence when silence would have sold honesty for performance. At the very end, in a small, quiet exchange. Lorenzo handed Leona a key to an office inside the estate. It was not a symbolic trinket nor a simple indulgence. It was a functional pass to a room where plans would be made and voices would be heard, an invitation to shape a future rather than merely survive one. "Keep it," he said. "If you ever want to leave it behind, the door will be open. But if you stay, make the city remember the cost of spectacle." She took the key with a levelness that had become her hallmark. "I'll make sure they remember," she said, and when she spoke into the rooms where men plotted maps and speeches, people listened. The maid, who had once urged him to stay silent, had become the woman whose voice steadied a king. The truth had stunned a city, not because it was sensational, but because it cut through the comfortable illusions everyone preferred. It demanded choices be made openly. If you found yourself pulled into that night, if the whisper of "stay silent" made your heart race, there's more like this waiting. Subscribe for another story where appearances unravel and people learn that power, like honesty, has a cost.